set in a fictional West African country. Resident Evil primary's antagonists are black people. Yeah. See, I told you guys he's gonna go this route. No. Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are the infectees that are in this fictional West African country. And the biggest antagonist here is Wesker. Now, you have Excella, you have Ricardo Irving, as we've stated before, but to say that the antagonists are black people is dumb. Now, he does say, yes, technically it's the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even after their infection. What are you saying? And then here, so where does Capcom go now? Personally, I'd look backwards to Code Veronica as the ideal candidate. Why would you look at Code Veronica if your whole point here is to make an argument that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake? So why would you say that? Why not say at the beginning, if your line of argumentation is going to be the same, you would state at the beginning that I don't think Resident Evil 5 remake should be remade. I think Code Veronica is in need of a remake more than Resident Evil 5. This is a prime example of how not to argue. You do not argue like this. Holy cow. You do not contradict yourself. You don't just start pulling in random thoughts mid-conversation. So in today's video, we're going to be discussing one of IGN's most unhinged Resident Evil articles. Now, as many of you guys know, IGN is notorious for giving out the worst opinion on movies and video games, so this shouldn't come as a surprise, but we're going to be dissecting this and explaining why most of this guy's arguments in this article are completely nonsensical. So let's get started. So the article's name is The Resident Evil Game That Can't Be Remade. It's time to rewrite, not remake. That's his whole, that's what he's going with. So I will state that this whole process, this whole article, it's okay like in the first half, but in the second half, oh my gosh, it gets really stupid. It gets really dumb. So let's just go over it. Let's just talk about it. So he first starts with saying, with Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's for starters, no, it's not. Okay, he's saying that Capcom's Capcom's plan to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. No, it's not. Unless you're counting Resident Evil 1 remake. But what about, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, those are not remade. We still got to remake those. We got to remake them in the new engine. So that right there, there's already a huge bias right before we start. But anyways, let's continue. But as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over. And so the big question is, where next? The obvious, and also, I should also add that the other game that he's also missing here is Code Veronica. Code Veronica, as many of the community also wants, is an Outbreak remake as well. So that makes absolutely no sense. Anyways. There's a lot of errors in the first startup. Anyways, says the obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5. But on the game's 15th anniversary, that was just like yesterday, by the way, it's clear that moving forward, chronologically, will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era, an era of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not the standards of Capcom's best work. And so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite. Okay, so like I said, the first half of the article is okay. Like it's not a great opinion, but it's somewhat decent. It's somewhat cohesive. There's obviously a lot of biases that he has. He's missed a couple of things like Code Veronica. But the first thing that the issue here is that he's saying that it needs to be rewritten and not remade, right? Not a remake, but needs to be rewritten. So the issue with that is that a lot of the remakes have rewritten a lot of stuff. They have changed a bunch of stuff. So a lot of what Capcom has already stated in the past is that Resident Evil remakes are more of a reimagining and not a remake, right? They are remaking, but they are changing a couple of stuff. Even with Resident Evil 4 remake, right? Like, an example that I'm thinking at the top of my head is how we had we had Wesker show up on the island, right, in the Ganello, in the island in Spain. That never happened in the OG. Or the fact that Eder fights U3, right, or how they changed it here to be Pesanta. In the OG RE4, that didn't happen. So it's obviously being rewritten. Now, obviously, they're gonna the best remakes, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4, if we're talking about the newer stuff, what made them really good was that those games stick to the story. It's stuck to the story. Obviously, you could argue that, the B scenario in Resident Evil 2, whatever, we're not going to go over that. But what I'm saying is that it tried to stick to the story as much as possible while also changing a couple of things. So it's already, so I don't know why he's saying that it needs to be, like, you know, the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite. You know, it's not the same case. Resident Evil remakes are not in the same, they've never been done in the same fashion as, like, for example, Dead Space. We got a remake for Dead Space. They only changed like minor things. It was just a direct remake. Or if we even if we look at like what Naughty Dog did with Last of Us, they remade it. It doesn't make sense why he's saying that, you know, it's not a remake, it needs to be rewritten. It's like, have you played the other remakes? So that right there is there's a huge issue there. But anyways, let's continue. It basically says Resident Evil is a survival horror series. Now that you'd know that, not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5, sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but RE5 is an action game through and through. Yeah, I would say action horror just because that's like he said with the horrific imagery, but I get what he's going at here. Now, that's evident in its cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rail turret sequences, and the constant rattle of assault rifles. Even if its visual design evokes sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s, it all speaks to a series that has lost its way. Rather than reflect on the tenets that were on the foundation of its existence, Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist, I don't know what that is, in an attempt to find a new lease of life. The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's an ugly, unwielding as it sounds. Now, I would say that Resident Evil 6 is way more actiony than Resident Evil 5. Now, don't get me wrong. Resident Evil 5 is... Resident Evil first started with the action stuff. I would say, like, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil 3, around that time, that's when they were like, let's do action. And then, you know, with Resident Evil 5, they're just like, forget it, bro. Like, Resident Evil 4, they did keep a lot of the action, obviously, but Resident Evil 5 was pushing the boundaries even more, right? Out of the action horror or the survival horror just went down. Like, there was no surviving. It was just pick up ammo, go. That started with Resident Evil 4. So it just got progressively worse. But I mean, I do get where he's coming from. He's basically saying that, you know, there's shooter mechanics, there's vehicle chases, on-rail turret sequences. It is, you know, they were trying to experiment with more of the action-y stuff that you would see in like the CGI movies, right? At this time, we got, you know, Resident Evil Degeneration, a lot of action in that one. You know, we also got all the Resident Evil movies. So Capcom, I think, was like, you know what, let's add some more action. It seems people really like the movies, those Mila Jovovich movies, so let's do it. Now, he continues on saying the design appears not to be just misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also a misreading of its predecessor, with the Resident Evil 4 director Shinji Mikami definitely reinvented the series through the use of new over-the-shoulder camera angle. The perspective allowed for more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the horror at the core of Resident Evil. Though use of enemies that were strategically placed to provide undulating waves of tension and fear, and inclusion of Ashley as your vulnerable charge, combat encounters were focused on surviving overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. Now, I get where he's saying here too. I mean, Shinji Mikami is obviously, if you guys don't know, he's the creator of Resident Evil. He left Capcom after Resident Evil 4. So Resident Evil 5 was, you know, the new guys. They basically made Resident Evil. And obviously, like I said, they took the decision to make it more action heavy. So anyways, let's continue. Resident Evil 5, you know, as mentioned, the first half of this article, there's nothing really wrong with what he's saying. Some of the stuff he's gotten wrong, but it's fine. But it's just the second half. We're getting there. The second half is just where everything just loses. The whole argument collapses on itself. But anyways, let's see. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry. Their purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels, and those levels are not locations to be explored. Instead, they are largely funnels that push you from entrance to exit. Resident Evil 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete levels in an attempt to move away from backtracking heavy design of previous games, but it persevered the spirit of locations like Raccoon City Police Station, the Village, Salazar's Castle, and the Island feature. Okay, so I wouldn't really say that the Village is a good example. I think the Village really did take a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, so that's a little stretching it a little. What he's getting at here, his whole argument is that Resident Evil 5, it changed the series and he doesn't want it remade because he thinks it needs to be rewritten. Again, there's a huge issue with that because most of the remakes are reimaginings. That's what Capcom has stated, and what they mean by that is that they're going to remake the game, they're going to change a couple of things, but the best ones that have been successful is Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 3 Remake reimagined too much. So this article is basically, you could take everything about what this guy is saying and basically say, like, what, do you want it to be completely rewritten? Do you want another Resident Evil 3 remake on our hands? Now, as I've stated several times, I thought that game was a good game. It was a great game. I had fun playing Resident Evil 3 Remake, but it was not as good as the OG. It was not faithful. They cut out huge sections, right? Like the clock tower. They cut out like major sections of the, we're not going to get into that, you know, like the raccoon part, whatever. let's just continue with this. But yeah, so he says Salazar Castle and the island feature interlocking explorable pathways that solidify these locations as authentic spaces. Rather than obstacle courses. Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. Their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kijuju autonomous zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. I don't know about that. I mean, Resident Evil 5 did a really good job of adding a lot of story aspect. Yeah, it was action-packed. Yeah, it was a little goofy at times. You know, I'm just thinking of, what's his name? I always forget his name. the guy that is like a weapons salesman or whatever. He's got a white suit. He's got a really high-pitched voice. What's his name? Ricardo Irving. That's I always forget his name, but there we go, we got it. That guy is really annoying. But I will say that the whole Spencer Mansion and, you know, the comparison to do that with the Kijuju, you do have a connection there with the Spencer estate. So I don't know what he's getting at here. You know what I mean? Like, he's trying to make it seem as if it's not at the same level. But I mean, we actually, you know, as many of us are Wesker fans, this whole channel is called Project Wesker. There is a lot of Wesker backstory that's in, you know, DLCs like The Lost in Nightmare. You know, a lot of what Resident Evil 5 was kind of alluding to, we got backstory to that, you know, with the Spencer estate in Lost in Nightmare. So, and I would argue that the Spencer estate is very similar to Spencer Mansion, obviously not at the same level. So I get that part of what he's saying in his argument, but still, it seems like he's just completely trashing Resident Evil 5. And as mentioned, if Capcom were to remake the game, they would rewrite a bunch of stuff. You know, I imagine they wouldn't just all of a sudden make the game like into, you know, like you go to each level, right? That's how Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 were split up. So basically, you had a little sandbox of an area, and then when you were done, you would go to the door and you'd press circle and say, you know, Sheva. You know, Chris, you know, you would do that whole circle thing, and that was just to progress the game further. Obviously, that was due to the times back in those days where, you know, they didn't have, they couldn't just make it a whole seamless transition where they could just keep going. And if they were to remake Resident Evil 5, you would just automatically assume that it wouldn't be the same experience. So, as mentioned, this whole argument, this whole article doesn't even make any sense. Like, from the start, like, he's arguing something that shouldn't be argued. Like, he's arguing that it should be rewritten, and it's like most remakes are reimaginings. Like, they are getting rewritten. So what are you talking about, man? Anyways, let's continue. All is this to say the faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series reset point. Resident Evil 7 was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew even larger as you unlock new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinventions of the base conceit. I think he means concept is key to Resident Evil's success. Be the dropping of an unstoppable force in the house corridors. Resident Evil 2's Mr. X is expanding the scope of the house. Resident Evil Village titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets and its rooms are houses. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design. A modern recreation of it would only further highlight. No. Okay, so here again, this is the big issue with his whole point. A modern recreation, a modern reimagining of Resident Evil 5 would not further highlight its flaws. It didn't. You know, we got Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 2 remake. We got Resident Evil, you know, even Resident Evil 3 remake. It didn't. Resident Evil 3 remake is not a good, faithful, you know, remake. We already know that. As Resident Evil fans, we know that it's not good. But it didn't highlight its flaws. It actually, a lot, like, if we're looking at the gameplay mechanic, you could dodge, you could do a bunch of stuff. Everything ran smoothly. The only issue with that game, I would say, is that the reimagining cut out a lot about the original. Now, Resident Evil 2 remake and Resident Evil 4 remake, they added all the stuff that they had. Yes, they left out maybe a couple of things, but it was rewritten. It was people playing the game understood that it was going to be a reimagination. So again, him saying that a modern recreation of it would only highlight its flaws, how? If they were to remake the game from the ground up, you know, by reimagining everything that they did with Resident Evil 5, why would we have the same flaws? Like, for example, one of the flaws of Resident Evil 5 is the really poor AI with Sheva. Like, that's not going to be a flaw if they were to remake it. They were not going to have a dumb AI partner. You know what I mean? Like, even if we were to do that, though, I do have a theory video, or I guess an idea video of how they could do co-op. By the way, I still have to make that, so stay tuned for that. But my point here is that there's other flaws, but having a remake wouldn't highlight those flaws. Like I just mentioned, one of the biggest flaws too was that every room that you went to was almost like you kept going to room in Resident Evil 5. It was almost like every area had had, you could only run into that area, and then to progress further, you're going to call your partner at the door, be super annoying. That is a huge flaw in the game's pacing. But you wouldn't have that if it was in the remake. Like, it just, again, like, it seems this guy doesn't really understand that they're reimaginings and not just remakes. This is not Dead Space, a remake. It's not like a 1-to-1 or like a Last of Us remake, where it's just the same game with just a new coat of paint. That's not what Resident Evil remakes have done. As mentioned, they're reimagining. So anyways, let's finish up this article, because yeah. Cinetation says, yeah, they better keep in a call feature though, maybe while running around, so you can still hear Sheva, come on, hurry. Yeah, to keep like an homage to the original, right? But anyways, let's continue. It says, remakes can of course completely redefine the structure of their source material. Okay, so I don't understand what he's talking about here. He basically just said remakes can of course complete. That's been the case for Resident Evil. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what? Like, literally every Resident Evil has done this. They've redefined the structure of the source material. Now he says Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognizably an updated version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997. Yeah, literally that's been the case for Resident Evil 2 remake, Resident Evil 3, Resident Evil 4 remake. So I don't get his point here. Now he's saying that it can. Obviously, I think it seems to me like he hasn't played the remakes, and he's just referring to Final Fantasy VII here, which I haven't played. But yeah, anyways, let's continue. And so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually Resident Evil most in need of a remake. Okay, so now it seems like he just switched. He switched his whole point, and there's no argument here. So he says, and so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually... How could you argue that? None of your points before has said that. The only point that he keeps bringing up is that Resident Evil 5 needs to be rewritten, not be remade. And I guess his point here, I guess what he's trying to say is that Resident Evil 5 had a lot of issues in the original one. It basically strayed away from survival horror and went to horror, just, to action horror. And so he thinks that that's the reason to go to Resident Evil 5 remake. Okay, so that's a weak argument, because I could say the same thing about Resident Evil Code Veronica. As I stated before, the first time where action started being really a big deal in Resident Evil was Resident Evil 3, OG Nemesis, and Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil Code Veronica had a lot of action. You could see it in the cinematics, like that whole cinematic where you see freaking Steve sidekick a Bandersnatch, freaking jump out a window, freaking roll. Like, there's a lot of action in that game. So I could, with those same argument points that he's made, I could do the same thing with Resident Evil Code Veronica. So as mentioned, this argument here doesn't really make sense, and it's coming out of the blue. He should have mentioned this up above when he was stating all the issues with Resident Evil 5, not just included here. It doesn't make sense. It just, like, his whole, it's not cohesive to his whole argumentation. Anyways, let's continue. He says a whole new environmental structure and scenario design that reins in the action and dials up the horror would bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem, racism. Okay. What? Wait, what? But all this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem, racism. Okay, now before we continue, this is the point of the article where things just go out the window. And you can actually see it before. Like I said, this whole point that he said, you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually Resident Evil 4 most in need of a remake. This whole section is where all his line of argumentation, his whole cohesive point here, goes out the window. He's just pulling in all the arguments, and he's just coming up with this. Now, before we continue, I should mention that back in 2009, Capcom was getting a lot of flack about racism. A lot of people during 2009, now I should mention, I was a teenager back then. I wasn't following Resident Evil news as closely, but I did have a family member, like one of my cousins. He was looking at a lot of Resident Evil news. He was a little older. So he did tell me that there was a lot of flack going Capcom's way for Resident Evil 5. And the reason... The way Capcom basically, fought this whole racism kind of thing, this kind of argument that it's racist because you're in Africa, even though there's a ton of problems with that. We'll dive into those problems. Is they added white people, and they added certain Indian-looking people, right? So they added East Asian people and as well as Caucasian people in the mix of Resident Evil 5, and so that's why when you play Resident Evil 5, you'll encounter maybe a Caucasian person. You'll encounter, you know what I mean? Like, you'll encounter, an East Indian person, East Asian person. You know what I mean? Like, that's the whole point. That's how Capcom was able to fight against all of the supposed racism. Now, I don't have to mention to you guys how dumb this argument is. It's trying to say that, I know what he's going to say already. He's going to say that Capcom is is racist because we're Americans, playing as Chris Redfield, going into an African village and attacking African people. That's not what Resident Evil is about. This guy obviously doesn't know what Resident Evil is about. We're not fighting people. They're not talking about people. This is not a culture game. We're not going into a Resident Evil game and learning about culture. This isn't Assassin's Creed. We're not going into a different city and learning about it. We're just going to a place that, and I should also mention, as he mentioned before, this is Kijuju. This is a made-up area in Africa. Obviously, yes, they are speaking Swahili during Resident Evil 5, but this has nothing to do with the game. The whole game's purpose, the whole story of the game is that you go in a village where people are infected. They're infected. It's the same thing with Resident Evil 4 Remake. So if you're going to make the argument that Resident Evil 5 is racist, what about Resident Evil 4? What about Resident Evil 6? Resident Evil 6, you go to China. You fight a lot of infected, Chinese people. Is that racist? I could even go so far as to say, I could steel man this whole thing by saying, oh, well, Resident Evil is racist because, the developers are Japanese and they're making a story about you fighting, American citizens that are that are infected. Like this rabbit hole of argumentation for saying that Resident Evil 5 is racist makes zero sense. Anyways, let's actually see what he has to say. As mentioned, this article gets really bad, and this is why I got a lot of flack, is because of this section right here. But anyways, let's continue. So he says, set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil Primary's antagonists are black people. Yeah. See, I told you guys he's going to go this route. No. Resident Evil 5's primary antagonists are the infectees that are in this fictional West African country. And the biggest antagonist here is Wesker. Now, you have Excella, you have Ricardo Irving, as we've stated before, but to say that the antagonists are black people is dumb. Now, he does say, yes, technically it's the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting, but the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even after their infection. What are you saying? What is this guy saying? That's the infection. He's not saying that the nation is of mobs and predators. That's not what he's saying, who are violent even before they're... No, the whole game, you're fighting people that are already infected. I would even argue that in Resident Evil 5, at the start of Resident Evil 5, when you're walking through Kijuju and you're going down the street with Sheva and you see a bunch of the people are kind of kicking stuff, I think the reason I think this is what he's trying to get at here, is that that first encounter with just people, I don't think Chris and Sheva realize that they're infected. This is why in that scene, as you progress through and you're seeing all these people, they're looking at Chris and Sheva like, who are you? All of a sudden, they just disappear. It's trying to add a level of horror to this. That's the beginning. That's the beginning intro of the game. That's the prologue. So it's basically trying to depict, you could argue that as Chris and Sheva are going into the village, they notice people are acting weird. But of course, they're not, they don't think that they're infected. But in reality, it seems like that's what the game is alluding to. Now, you could argue and say, oh, well, when you're looking at the person at the beginning, they don't have infected eyes. I think that was an artistic point to try to make it seem so that it kind of lowers your defenses to think that these are normal people. Very similar to what Resident Evil 4 did as well, right, with the Ganello. The first Ganello that you encounter, he doesn't really have bloodshot eyes like in the OG RE4. I actually don't know about the remake, actually. I have to double check that. I'll probably put that as I'm talking, but he looked pretty normal, right? But the whole horror starts when you realize that these are not normal people. So I would argue that was just an artistic, and there is evidence for that. As mentioned, everybody just magically disappears, and it's really creepy all of a sudden. So there you see a bunch of people on the street, and then there's zero people. So this point that he's saying is that as a nation of mobs and predators who are violent even before their infection, I don't think that's right, because I don't think we've ever seen the people of Kijuju not infected. If they weren't infected, we would have actually seen them act normal. We would have seen them in the village normal, but that's never been the case. As mentioned before, Resident Evil doesn't go into countries' culture. It never talks about that. This isn't Assassin's Creed. It's not talking about history. It's not talking about people's culture. It's talking about infections in different parts of the world. So this whole right there, there's so many problems with this. But anyways, let's continue. So intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positions Africa as a dark continent. No, it doesn't. It literally doesn't. When does it ever say this? There's no evidence to suggest. If he's going off of the previous point, this whole line of argumentation is wrong from the start. So what? Resident Evil 5's position Africa as the dark continent, an uncivilized world harboring disease population that needs guiding down via Western intervention. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this is where this guy just went. Yeah, as mentioned, he's just trying to fit his. Oh my gosh, he's just trying to fit his ideology into the argument. Okay, let's continue. This is sensitive treatment of people of color was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer, with writers such as Neil Grohl and Steven Totu pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. The arguments and think pieces continued as well with the game's release window. Yeah, so I don't know if these are the two guys, right? I honestly don't care because this is a stupid point that happened before the game's release. Now, I'm pretty sure the first trailer for Resident Evil 5 was in 2007, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. I'll have to double check that. But the first trailer showed up like in E3, I think 2006, 2007, whatever. That's when it started getting a lot of hate because a lot of people were like, oh, this looks like it's racist. Why are we shooting in black people in Africa? And even though, as mentioned, that's never been the case with Resident Evil. And if you're going to use that line of argumentation, then what about Resident Evil 6? What about Resident Evil 4 with Spain? What about... And by the way, that argument doesn't work because, as mentioned, in Spain, you're not talking to Spanish people. You're not hanging out in Spanish culture, play your Spanish culture. You're not like in Barcelona. You're not in like Toledo or whatever. You're not in places in Spain where where you're actually talking to normal people. That's not what's happening in Resident Evil. You're literally in the middle of nowhere in this like occultic, group of people that are living like the 1800s. They're like, it has nothing to do. So even that argument that I was mentioning before that, you would have to say Resident Evil 4 is racist, it doesn't even make any sense, right? It doesn't even make any sense, but you would have to take it there if you were going to die on this hill. So anyways, he says the arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release window, with IGN's own former editor-in-chief, Hillary Goldstein, also having wrestled with the subject, but that was 2009, a time when race was apparently in debate rather than a reality. What? In the 2020s, in post-Black Lives Matter world, there's only one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game. No. As mentioned, he's not shooting Africans. He's shooting African people that have been infected. And this is a made-up area. It's not an actual spot. What is he smoking? Okay, anyways, let's continue. It says remakes may be able to redefine their source material, but there's only so many changes you can make it till it's a remake at all. But an entirely new game, and you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5. Is it Resident Evil 5 anymore? Even with the vastly improved, more sensitive take on the continent, perhaps one of the more black protagonists and more empathetic look at Outbreak, the experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5. Okay, wait, what? What did he just say here? And if you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5, is it really Resident Evil 5 anymore? Even with the vastly improved, more sensitive take on the content, perhaps. So he's actually entertaining this idea. He actually wants them to not go to He doesn't want them to go to Africa. It's like, dude, have you even played Resident Evil 5? Resident Evil 5 has a lot of story in Africa. It has a lot. There's it literally goes deep into how Umbrella was even founded. You know what I mean? Like how he was able to find the progenitor virus. It goes into the origin of all of that. It has nothing to do with people. They don't mention actual groups of people. They don't go into that. So again, what is he even suggesting here? He's suggesting that Africa isn't even a part of Resident Evil 5 Remake. The experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5. Okay, well, I'm sorry. Who's this guy that's writing this? I'm sorry, but that's never happening. Okay, if they remake 5, this is not going to be an issue. Because this is not an issue to begin with. Say that, that there's white people, white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game. That's not what's happening. You're diluting the whole thing to something to fit your narrative, honestly. This has nothing to do with Resident Evil. He's actually talking like there's a chance Resident Evil 5 wouldn't be made because of his... I know, like, what? That's what I mean. It makes absolutely no sense. I 100% agree, dude. It's crazy that he thinks he's even saying, yeah, but if Capcom were to take my side and not make it in Africa, it wouldn't be Resident Evil 5. So what are you arguing here? Why argue this then? Now he says, so where does Capcom go? No, personally I look backwards. Code Veronica as Ideal Canada as the original Resident Evil. But the only way is okay, so he's kind of second guessing himself here. As mentioned, he kind of just throws all his line of argumentation, but he's second guessing himself. He basically said that Resident Evil 5 is the only one that needs to be remade, right? He stated that at the beginning, didn't he? Here we go. This is where he said it. So you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. So this is what he states right here. This is how dumb the argument. Now, I should state I never attack the person. When you're arguing, you always want to attack what the person's points are, right? So that's just to keep it respectful. But this whole thing is really stupid. His whole line of argumentation is so dumb. So right here, he says, and so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually Resident Evil most in need of a remake. But he contradicts himself by stating all of this nonsense, right? We've gone over that. And then here. So where does Capcom go now? Personally, I'd look backwards to Code Veronica as the ideal candidate. Why would you look at Code Veronica if your whole point here is to make an argument that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake? So why would you say that? Why not say at the beginning, if your line of argumentation is going to be the same, you would state at the beginning that I don't think Resident Evil 5 remake should be remade. I think Code Veronica needs more of you could argue that Resident Evil Code Veronica is in need of a remake more than Resident Evil 5. So you see how that's what you would say if this whole line of argumentation actually was cohesive and actually made sense. This is what he would have stated at the beginning. He wouldn't have stated that, and you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually Resident Evil most in need. No, because that's not what you're saying here. You're not saying that. So this is what I mean. He's contradicting himself here by saying that. Personally, I'd look backwards to Code Veronica. Why would you look backwards if you were just arguing that Resident Evil 5 should be rewritten and not be remade? So like it doesn't even make any sense. And even as stated before, that whole start of this whole rabbit hole of argumentation makes zero sense. Resident Evil does not do remakes. It does reimaginings, right? They use the name remakes because they are obviously remaking it from the ground up, but it's not 100% one-to-one remake. So that's what makes Resident Evil different from other companies like Dead Space. So again, if his argument actually made sense, he would have stated at the beginning, I don't think Resident Evil 5 should be remade. I think Resident Evil Code Veronica should be remade. Why do I think that? Well, then that's when he goes into, I think Resident Evil 5 isn't good. It's not action. It's action horror. It has nothing to do with survival horror. Code Veronica does all, should be the one that does it because it is survival horror. And then you could also put in the whole racist thing that he was saying. All his points would actually make more sense. Obviously, that whole part where Resident Evil 5 is racist would not make sense here, but it would make even more sense than going back and forth and trying to say that, oh no, Code Veronica should be a remake now. Like it makes absolutely no sense. Like this guy obviously does not know how to argue, because that's not how you argue. You have to keep it cohesive. Anyways, and is the original, but if the only way is chronological forward, the total rewrite of what comes next is logical path, because what followed Resident Evil 4 was not one terrible game, but two. Resident Evil 6 doubled down or tripled down on the action-packed set piece to the extent it could be mistaken for a third-person Call of Duty spinoff were it not the monsters. Its restricted level design practically puts you on a chokehold, forcing you to endure a barrage of bombastic moments that have no interest invoking any sense of fear. Resident Evil 6 is survival horror, only in that it's a horrible game that you have to survive playing. But this time around, it doesn't have to be like that. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of timeline. So again, he contradicts himself again here. He basically says Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. So the reason he's contradicting himself here is because he's saying that Resident Evil 5 remake should he offered up the idea that Capcom should take away the Africa so that it's not racist, according to him. But he says, but then he contradicts at that point by counter arguing his own point. But then he says, but if you were to do that, Resident Evil 5 remake wouldn't make sense. But then he comes back a second and he doubles down and says Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. So it seems like he's fighting himself here. He's saying that Capcom should completely change Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6 is his point. But then he's like, no, don't do that or else it's not Resident Evil 5. But you know what? Capcom should do it. They should change Resident Evil 5 completely. Take the Africa out of there, completely change the story. And it's like, what are you talking about? Oh my gosh, guys, this is done. Anyways, let's finish this. Because this is so stupid. Oh my gosh. Okay. In Resident Evil 4 Remakes post-credits scene, evil mastermind Albert Wesker details his plan for world domination at Eder Wong, reflected in this glasses image of Exile Legion and the Stairway of the Sun. Yeah, he's talking about the end of Resident Evil Separate Ways, right? The Resident Evil 4 Remakes Separate Ways DLC. From Resident Evil 5, which indicates Capcom's intentions, but there's more to consider. This scene is largely a replication of the sequence from Assignment Ada, a non-canon chapter from original Resident Evil 4. It's a shift from the original canon points to willingness to... Wait, what? Wait, no. Okay, this article's done, guys, but wait, let's go back. What is he saying here? This scene is largely a replication of a sequence from Assignment Ada, non-canon chapter. What do you mean it's a replication of a sequence from Assignment Ada doesn't have those. What is he talking about? And he doesn't even state what they're talking about. He says non-canon chapter from the original Resident Evil 4. It's shift from unofficial to canon points to willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of the scene is entirely rewritten. Okay, so first off, Assignment Ada, there's no connection with Resident Evil 4. The game is, as you mentioned, it's a non-canon mini game where you're just going around. It's almost like before the events of Resident Evil 4. Ada drops down to the island, goes and grabs a bunch of vials, fights Krauser, and then gets out of there. That's the end of the mini game. So why is he saying that it's a replication? It's almost like a rehash of Assignment. That has nothing to do with Assignment Ada. Assignment Ada was just crazy. It was just literally had nothing to do with the game. It was just a mini game. So him saying it's a shift from unofficial canon points to willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of the scene is okay. So he doesn't even state what the similarities are. This is how bad this article is. He doesn't even state his argument is. He doesn't even state what is similar about it. The only thing he's saying is shift from unofficial canon. He's not making a point here, guys. And I'm just saying right now, no, it has nothing to do. Assignment Ada has nothing to do with the ending of Separate Ways in the Resident Evil 4 remake. It has nothing to do with that. So what is this guy smoking? Okay. Like I said, this article gets progressively worse at the halfway point. Wow. So he says it's a shift from unofficial canon points to willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of this scene is entirely rewritten when learning of Wesker's plan. Ryan dutifully delivers stolen Las Plagas sample to him. Eder betrays her shadowy boss and forces her helicopter pilot to turn around. In this moment of the future, Resident Evil becomes unclear. Cal is giving itself freedom to do whatever it wants. I just hope it's not a remake of Resident Evil 5. Okay, so even at the end, he contradicts himself. He contradicts his whole point because at the beginning he said that, Resident Evil 5 shouldn't be remade because of all these issues that would be highlighted if you brought it back. But it's like, wait a second. As you basically just stated at the end of the article, you stated that Resident Evil changes their story with the remakes. Oh, okay, well then that means that it's not a one-to-one remake. So what are you arguing here? This has nothing to do with anything. As mentioned, Resident Evil does reimaginations, so they do change their story. So even this guy, this is just bad. This is not how you argue. Just so you guys know. Yeah, take this as an example to not argue like this. This is just bad. Yeah, look, let's read some comments, guys. Cinetation says, wait, what he said, Excel has seen in Wesker's glasses in several ways a replica of Assignment A from OJ. What? I know. What does that have to do with Assignment Ada? You don't see those things. And it's also funny how he basically just omits that. He basically just hides that. He doesn't even explain the similarities. He says that it's like, just like how Cinetation said, he says it's a replication, but he doesn't even go down to actually list the replication. When you're comparing point A to point B, you have to give your points to say why are they similar? Why are these images different? You know what I mean? You got to circle it. You got to actually tell people what's similar about it. Wow, this guy just continually contradicts himself. This is how you know somebody's really bad at arguing, is when you can continue to contradict everything they said. Now, as mentioned, this article got blasted on Twitter, so much so that we'll look at it right here. So much so that Twitter basically just deleted the replies. It got reposted 2,000 times, almost 3, liked about 1. Why did it get liked? Wait, what? Yeah, they got blasted. So they basically just deleted the replies. This is how bad it is. So again, I should, like, as I preface at the start of this, IGN is a never one to actually make good like they never make good points. They're notoriously known for making really bad review scores. So this is not a surprise. At the end of the day, this is not a surprise that IGN did this, but this has to be one of the dumbest articles I've read. Yeah, this is not good. This is not good. This is a prime example of how not to argue. You do not argue like this. Holy cow. You do not contradict yourself. You don't just start pulling in random thoughts mid conversation, mid point of argumentation. You don't just put random stuff together and do something as lazy as saying that, oh, it's racist. You know, it has nothing to do with anything. As mentioned, if you were to go down that rabbit hole, you would have to say that Resident Evil 4 is racist because it's talking about random people that have nothing to do with Spain's culture, but in Spain. Kijuju is the same thing, so you have to say that that's racist. You have to say that Resident Evil 6 being in China is racist. You have to say that Japanese developers of a game that's set in America, that should also be racist according to this guy that wrote this article. This makes zero sense, and this is this is bad, guys. This is bad. Now, if you guys enjoyed this RE5 topic video, make sure to click this one right here. We actually talked and debunked 2 Resident Evil 5 leaks that just came out roughly around 3 weeks ago. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.